Be discussing a bombshell decision out of New Hampshire. Adam Montgomery's second-degree M conviction in the death of his 5-year-old daughter, Harmony Montgomery, has been overturned. And this is one of the most tragic cases I've ever followed. Why is that? Because the conviction was reversed. And it was reversed because the Supreme Court of New Hampshire concluded that the way prosecutors presented the case may have prevented the defendant, who's a vile man, from receiving a fair trial. So the question here I'd like to present to you guys is whether procedural safeguards should outweigh a jury's guilty verdict in one of the most heartbreaking child M cases in recent memory. So welcome to the Margaret McLean Show. I'm a former prosecutor and civil trial attorney, and I'm your courtroom translator. My job is to take you behind the scenes and explain the law. So please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and of course, turn those notifications on. So some of you may not know who Harmony Montgomery was. Before we get into the facts, I'm going to pull her up onto the screen here. I've made a slideshow. So I'm going to use, one second. I'm going to make this one right here. I mean, she's, let's see. All right here. Add to stage. Okay, there we go. So that's Harmony Montgomery as a little girl. And the sad thing is there's not that many pictures of her. And that's because she was bounced around foster home to foster home, and nobody even bothered to take a picture of her. And I find that tragic as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this beautiful girl with the glasses, Harmony. So basically, what Harmony is only lived to be 5 years old. And she was born in Massachusetts. She was actually born Harmony Renee Montgomery, beautiful name, on June 7th, 2014. Actually, that's a day after my birthday, so that's why it sticks even more. She was born to Crystal Sorey and Adam Montgomery. Those were her parents. They'd split up before she was born. Poor Harmony she was partially blind in her left eye and really had special needs from the beginning. You can see the way she's wearing with her glasses there. Crystal, the mom, originally had full custody of Harmony because her dad, Adam, was in jail. So when Harmony was born, but within days of her birth, there were multiple reports of neglect. I mean, think about this little tiny baby and the mother's neglecting the little baby. And of course, the mother had drug issues of her own at the time. So the Department of Children and Families was notified in Massachusetts. So of course, little Harmony was placed in foster care, originally with Tim and Michelle Rafferty when she was only 2 months old. But she spent the next 4 years in DCF custody. And again, that's the Department of Children and Families, and in various foster homes. And then at her mother's when her mother was sober or not on drugs, which wasn't very often. But the sad thing is, early on, this Massachusetts agency that was supposed to protect children really failed Harmony. They failed to fully assess Harmony's special needs, her medical care, her well-being, and of course, her safety. And she fell through the cracks and was bounced around in the system. As I mentioned, her mom was a drug addict and completely lost custody of Harmony and her other child in 2018. Now, let's see if I have a picture here of the mom. I know I do in my slideshow, so I'm going to, yep, that's more of Harmony. She's so beautiful. And again, not very many pictures. That's I hate to say it, the scumbag dad, Adam Montgomery. And hold on, that's not the natural mother. Okay, I don't have any of the natural mother, but in, here's how, I'll just leave it here. So In 2019, the father, Adam, I guess I'll put him up here. So let's see. Here is Adam. Adam gets out of jail. And of course, God knows why he hated the mother of his child, but he decided to go for full custody of Harmony. And at the time, he was living in New Hampshire. Based what I've read, and I've done a lot of research on this case, the social workers and the court placed so much emphasis here on parental rights, the rights of Adam, over the protection of the little girl. They failed to make an adequate assessment of the father, who was very, very unstable. He was living with his wife, Kayla, and their two sons in New Hampshire, and the sons were younger than Harmony. So both Adam and Kayla, they had substance abuse issues. They paid their drug dealer in SNAP food stamps. So the kids didn't even have enough food. And in fact, Harmony spent, this is an interesting stat, she spent only 40 hours with her father for supervised visits from birth to age 4.5. And that's simply not enough time for those agencies to consider even placing her with her dad. The dad's been in jail, so how on earth is he going to know how to be a fit parent? So, and I'm going to pull up a picture again of the home that they were considering giving Harmony to. So look at these people. All right, that's the dad. So this is the dad's wife. Like, look at her. I mean, she looks out of her mind right there, right? So right here is a good picture of her. So they're going to place this little 5-year-old with special needs with this drugged out woman, okay? So I'll tell you a little bit about the custody proceeding here. That occurred in Massachusetts. Harmony's lawyer didn't do any homework whatsoever, really, to advocate for her. And that's what us lawyers are supposed to do, advocate for the children. They're supposed to look at both sides, whether this child should be placed with the father and that woman or be placed in foster care. So no one addressed how the placement would provide her with the medical care she needed or the transition itself. There was no system in place for Harmony. But Judge Mark Newman of the Juvenile Court of Massachusetts awarded Adam custody, despite the fact he was in jail for most of her life. They improperly approved the cross-border placement without making sure Harmony would be protected in New Hampshire. So no one checked on the drug use and the conditions of the house, and it was bad. So after the placement, family members reported abuse, yet no one intervened. No one from the state intervened. Nothing. The father, Adam, thought it was okay to slap this little girl around. Now, Harmony was first reported missing by her mother, Crystal Sorey, to the Manchester, New Hampshire Police Department in November of 2021. Sorey made the report after her repeated attempts to contact Adam Montgomery because she wanted to see her daughter, but he ignored her and then he blocked her. She went to the police and told them she had not physically seen her daughter since a FaceTime call in April of 2019. And that's what, about 2 years. So following this report, the police finally acted and announced the investigation and made a public plea for any information on Harmony. And that was on December 31st, 2021. So now at that point, she's missing. And after a search and an investigation, both Adam and Kayla Montgomery were arrested. Just so you know, with the search and everything, they never found poor little Kayla. They never found her body. So again, when it ultimately went to trial as a former prosecutor, this is a no-body case and it's really hard to prove. So now what I want to pull up is the actual, let's get rid of this grossly, I hate to say it, but gross looking woman. So now I'd like to pull up the complaint. Let's see, remove this woman, right? Get her out of here. And now here's not the complaint, but the official ruling from the judges in this case. They explained why they reversed it, okay? So I'm going to make me smaller and that larger so we can actually go through it. And The facts of this case, as laid out by the appellate court, right, the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, are very disturbing. They didn't listen to any testimony, but what they did was listen to trial transcripts. So they don't retry the case. They look at the facts of the case, and then they make sure that the law is applied properly here. So I just want to show you what they wrote so we can see what came out at trial and some of the abuse that happened here and how poor Kayla, or how poor Harmony fell through the cracks. So let's look at this. All right, here's the statement of the facts. So the court goes on to say the jury could have found the following facts. The defendant was the biological father of the victim, Harmony Montgomery, the defendant, Adam. In February of 2019, the victim went to live with the defendant and his wife, Kayla Montgomery, at the defendant's grandmother's home in Manchester. And that was when the custody was awarded in Massachusetts by the juvenile judge. In July 2019, when the first charged offense occurred, so the first abuse charge, the victim was only 5 years old. The other occupants of the home at the time included the defendant's uncle, so Adam's uncle, and 2 biological children of the defendant who were both younger than the victim, Harmony. So the uncle returned home in July from a 3-week trip and saw the victim in the kitchen with a black eye. So he sees little Harmony, who's a 5-year-old, with a black eye. The uncle asked the victim what she'd done, and of course the father, Adam, the defendant, answered, "She didn't do anything. I bashed her around the house." The uncle testified that the defendant put the victim in charge to watch her five-month-old brother while the defendant used the bathroom, and when the defendant returned, he found the victim with her hands over the baby's mouth, and his lips were supposedly blue. I don't buy that for a second. I'm just saying. I listened to the testimony, and I think he was lying through his teeth. He didn't testify. In fact, in the first trial, he decided not to even show up, which is very rare. So here's some more facts about what happened to poor Harmony and how she was failed by the system. On November 27, 2019, the defendant's family was evicted from the home in Manchester. So the defendant, Kayla, and the 3 children began living in their car. And that's November. So remember, it's cold in November in New Hampshire. So they parked at a friend's apartment complex in Manchester. This is really sad. Although the victim was toilet trained before she was 3 years old, she started to have accidents once the family began living in the car. When the victim had an accident, the defendant became angry and would hit her in the face or on her leg or hand. And the defendant became angrier the more accidents the victim had and would then hit her repeatedly. Imagine the stress this little girl is having. And of course, with stress, there probably comes more accidents. This little kid was so afraid. She's living in a car. I doubt she's going to school. And the parents are doing drugs all around her because they had major problems. This little girl is it's just a shame. It makes me sick to my stomach because I'm a parent of 3. So here we have on December 7th, 2019, the victim had an accident early in the morning and the defendant repeatedly punched her in the head. Later that morning, the family drove to a methadone clinic where Kayla and the defendant took turns going inside while the other stayed in the car with the children. When the defendant returned to the car, he realized the victim had yet another accident, started yelling at her and hitting her in the head repeatedly. This is a big man hitting a little girl in the head. From the methadone clinic, the defendant drove the family to Burger King, where while they were driving, the victim was in the back seat crying and making a strange moaning-like noise. The defendant told the victim to shut up, and at each red light at which they stopped, the defendant reached back and repeatedly punched her in the head. The defendant stopped hitting her when they got to Burger King. With the final punch, he said in a scared voice that he felt something and thought he really hurt her this time. It's just a tragedy. So later that day, the family's car broke down at a traffic light and they had to abandon it. As the defendant and Kayla were getting the children out of the car, the victim did not respond and they realized she had died. So the defendant, the father, goes and gets a duffel bag from the trunk, put the victim's body in it, and brought it back to a friend's apartment complex where the defendant threw it into a snowbank. And this is where the abuse of a corpse charge comes from later on. Following the loss of their car, the family stayed in a friend's car, then with Kayla's mother, and then from December 30th through February 20th at the family's in transition shelter in Manchester. So each time the defendant brought the duffel bag containing her body to each place where they stayed. So at the shelter, he put the duffel bag in the ceiling vent in their room. And when the victim's body began to smell and leak fluid, the defendant put the body into garbage bags, which he then stuffed into a diaper bag. And the defendant worked at a restaurant at the time and would store the bag in the restaurant's freezer while he was there. So the family then moved from the shelter to an apartment in Manchester. There he kept the body in the apartment's freezer. And then he began discussing getting rid of the body and devised a plan to dismember her and use lime, which he believed would hasten the decomposition. On February 26th, the defendant withdrew cash from an ATM and purchased lime, an angle grinder, a blade, and a battery. So all this evidence came in. At some point thereafter, the defendant thawed the victim's body in the bathtub at the apartment and had his wife, Kayla, help remove her clothing. The defendant had a large bag of lime, spent several hours in the bathroom with the body. When the defendant was finished, he put the victim's body back into the diaper bag and put the bag back in the freezer. So now on March 3rd, the defendant and Kayla stayed in an eco lodge with a friend of the defendant and the friend's girlfriend. The defendant had asked the friend to rent a U-Haul. He needed to move stuff. Then that evening, the friend arranged the rental back at the hotel. The friend said she heard the defendant went out to smoke a cigarette, and he began pacing back and forth and saying, "I effed up." He certainly did. So then he left the hotel in the middle of the night. He took the diaper bag containing the victim's body with him and returned without it, telling Kayla he got rid of her. So after he got rid of the victim, he began telling people he had returned her to her mother in Massachusetts after Thanksgiving in 2019. The victim's mother had not seen her since April, and therefore she tried to contact the defendant, and we talked about this before, and she finally contacted the police. So the defendant was indicted by the grand jury on one count of each of the following: second degree M, second degree assault for having struck Harmony in July of 2019, falsifying physical evidence, witness tampering. He was also charged by criminal complaint with abuse of a corpse. The defendant filed a motion to join the charges for trial. So this is the defendant. And what does that mean? I'm going to translate that. So instead of trying the prior abuse charges from December of 2021 with the M charges of July of 2019, the defendant originally, through his lawyer, said, "We'll try them all together." However, after the defendant filed a new motion, which was assented to, agreed upon, to join the charges for trial, which the court granted. Subsequently, the defendant, I don't think the court should have granted that motion, by the way, and I'll explain. So the defendant subsequently moved to sever the second degree assault charge from the other charges, saying that he learned that Kayla Montgomery had made a substantial departure from her prior statements, meaning Kayla Montgomery was the drugged out wife who was living in the car with Adam Montgomery and the two kids, and she ultimately had lied to the police. Then she decided she was probably scared because they arrested both of them and they were pointing fingers at each other. Adam was saying that it was Kayla who M'd Harmony, and then Kayla got scared and was saying it was Adam. But there seemed to be more corroborating evidence that it was in fact Kayla, and she began cooperating with the police. So that's what happened there. And at that point, the defense says, we need to sever these charges. All right. And so I want to explain that a little bit. I'm going to translate that because here we go here. The problem with the prior abuse charges is it may prejudice the jury. And let me explain that in a second in more legal terms here. So, oh, by the way, well, I'll get to that. So this is what the appellate court heard arguments on. What to do. Did the trial judge make a mistake early on by not separating out those charges, by not having two trials? So why is that important legally? And it's such an emotional case. Most people were upset about that. So because it was ultimately reversed. So the court's concern centered on the decision by the trial judge to try the two separate allegations together. Okay, the earlier assault charge involving Harmony and the charge involving Harmony's death. Ordinarily, courts are cautious about allowing jurors to hear evidence of a defendant's prior bad acts when deciding a separate charge. The reason is actually simple. Jurors may begin to think, now, if he abused Harmony before, he must have emmed her. That makes sense. He's a bad guy. He hit her all. Who hits a child? No, he hit her back in a few months ago. He definitely did it. So that creates prejudice for the defendant. The law requires jurors to decide each charge based solely on the evidence relative to that charge, not on a belief that the defendant is a bad person or has a criminal disposition. So the Supreme Court, the New Hampshire Supreme Court, concluded that combining the assault and M charges created an unacceptable risk that the jury's consideration of the M charge was influenced by evidence of the prior abuse. So you don't want to influence the jury. We also have the prejudice problem. Courts often balance two competing interests: judicial efficiency, which means trying related charges together, and the defendant's right to a fair trial. The justices determined that the prejudice from the assault evidence outweighed the benefits of hearing everything together in one trial. From my perspective, that's a prosecutor's perspective, the assault evidence helped tell the story of Harmony's treatment and demonstrated the defendant's relationship with his daughter, which was so abusive. He was a bad, vile person. But from a defense perspective, the evidence risked encouraging jurors to reason he assaulted Harmony before, therefore he must have emmed her. And that is exactly the type of reasoning courts try to prevent. Adam Montgomery, thank God, is still in jail on assault charges and abuse of a corpse, and he isn't getting out anytime soon. You may be wondering why. The assault conviction wasn't reversed. The assault conviction itself was supported by evidence directly related to that charge. In other words, the Supreme Court was not saying the assault never happened. Rather, it found that the evidence of the assault should not have been used in a manner that potentially tainted the jury's consideration of the separate murder allegation. That's why the assault conviction remains intact, while the M conviction does not. The court also upheld convictions for falsifying physical evidence, witness tampering, and abuse of a corpse. Those charges involve different conduct and different evidence. The Supreme Court of New Hampshire evidently concluded that whatever procedural error affected the M charge did not undermine the jury's verdicts on those other offenses. So at least we have that. Now you may be wondering, well, what happens next? prosecutors can retry the murder case. They can use the same evidence. In fact, the Attorney General's office has already announced his intention to do so. But the challenge for prosecutors will be presenting the M case without creating the same prejudicial concerns identified by the Supreme Court, right? They will proceed with a separate M trial and carefully navigate what evidence regarding the prior bad acts can be introduced and for what purpose. So, this second trial is going to be very much limited, and some legal experts, kind of including me, are a little bit worried because the M case, the second degree M case, really relies on the testimony of the drug addict lying Montgomery woman, right? Kayla Montgomery. And I showed you a picture. She looks out of it. I watched her testify at trial. They easily could get her during cross examination because she made so many prior inconsistent statements. But it's also such a horrible case that I'm sure the jury is going to have sympathy for this child. So, the bigger legal principles here is this ruling, I'd say, illustrates a core principle of law, a core principle of the justice system. Courts are not concerned with whether the right person was convicted. Of course, everybody wanted this guy convicted. He's a bad guy. But courts are equally concerned with whether the conviction was obtained through a fair process. The process has to be fair. The Supreme Court's decision says nothing about whether Adam Montgomery took Harmony's life. Instead, it says the state must prove that allegation in a manner that protects the defendant's constitutional right to a fair trial, whether you like it or not. And the distinction is often difficult for the public to accept in emotionally charged cases involving children, like this one. And I read you those facts. Those are really hard to swallow. Yet, appellate courts frequently emphasize that procedural safeguards exist precisely for the hardest and most emotionally compelling cases, where the risk of prejudice is greatest. So, I will be following this case, and I anticipate it might be 9 months, maybe less, before it's tried in New Hampshire. It will likely be televised again, and I do hope I don't like this guy, so I do hope they get a conviction this second time around, and I'm sure another jury is going to do the right thing. But again, is Kayla Montgomery, she's a star witness. She's not a good witness. The question would be, is she back using drugs? She's no longer in jail. That's going to be tough. It's going to be really, really tough for prosecutors to deal with her as a witness. We also have, she has to live up to any plea agreement, which is like a contract. So, as part of the plea agreement, she can't go on drugs and she has to be sober in order to testify. I don't know, but we shall see what happens. And in the meantime, if you have any questions about this case or any of the other cases I've followed, please ask them in the comments and I will get back to you and answer them. And once again, thank you very much for following my channels, for subscribing. If you haven't, please subscribe. And I will be following this case plus many others in the future. So I wish you all a very good night. And let's see. Oh, wait, let's see if I have some questions. Oh, I do have a response. How absolutely heartbreaking this case is. And before I close, I do want to take this down, okay, and add Harmony's picture because I just want to show you this beautiful, beautiful little girl. That's the scum. I hate to use the word, but that's the star witness for the prosecution. That's Kayla Montgomery, the star witness. I hope she looks better than that when she the case is tried. And let's see. That's slide 5. So we have, oh, that's, she doesn't look much better there. Of course, there's Kayla Montgomery and Adam Montgomery, and then poor little Kayla in the middle. And then we have Adam again. And I'm going to end it with beautiful pictures, very few pictures of Kayla out there. And there she is right there as well. So again, have a wonderful night. Think of Kayla, think of her in your prayers, and hope maybe someday they'll actually find her remains too, which they haven't found yet. But I'm ending on a sad note, but have a very good night, and I'll see you next